I'll cut that out. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we are joined by continuing guest host, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, where we're going to be talking about the predictors of endurance performance. Robbie, welcome back to the show. So right before we started recording and everything, we had been talking about how, kind of how as researchers and scientists, we don't actually know as much as we think we know. So I want to bring us back to that conversation because I think it's really important for everybody to kind of get on the same page of like, yes, as researchers, we are trying to validate these ideas that we have, and we're trying to take this theory and, get it to the applied side of things. But I think it's important to note that, one study does not prove a hypothesis, right? A hypothesis can never be proven. It can really only be falsified. So we're always in this uphill battle of trying to do good research and get it validated a little bit more towards more populations as we go.
Well, and then when you introduce the world of probability, because science also exists in the world of probability. What's the probability that this is going to happen? And when we hear statistical significance, it's usually some level of probability that we've designated is meaningful in some way, right? But probability depends on a host of factors, and especially the deeper you get into biological context and variability, sometimes it's so overwhelming that sometimes I really wonder how accurate the knowledge that I think I know even is.
Yeah. Well, and the good thing is that, that's why we have multiple people doing multiple studies on these sort of things, because then our chances of discovering false positives are reduced, and I can't remember what type of error it is reduced, and it's like oh well, the cutoff of statistical significance is normally 0.05, but what happens if something is 0.0500000001, right? Technically, from a statistical standpoint, it's not significant, but that doesn't mean that it's a pretty high probability, like we're talking about, that it is still true in the context of whatever study we're doing. So that was actually something that I loved about my PhD with Matt and Sean, was that, and those were my advisors at Oregon State, for those of you who don't know, was that especially Dr. Matt Robinson, he was always really good at being like, okay, well, yeah, maybe this study wasn't the best design study. Maybe the stats weren't, as perfect as we'd like them to be, but what can we learn from it? And what can we take away from it? And that's always something that I have to remind myself, because like we were talking about earlier, it's really easy to sit up here in our porcelain, or would it be a porcelain throne, or it would it be a porcelain throne? That's a bathroom joke. Oh, dang. Coming in hot.
Most people probably would refer to it as a porcelain porcelain tower these days, rather than the ivory tower.
The ivory tower, that's what it is. So most of us are sitting up in our ivory tower, and we're like really good at picking apart these studies, right? They're like, oh well, they only use 12 people, and they're all elite level athletes, so there's no application to non-trained athletes because we don't know. Or, well, why didn't they increase their intervention to 54 months or something like that? And there's limitations to what we can do in research. A lot of the limitations come down to money, and I think you can attest to this. Like when we were doing my study in my master's degree, we didn't have any funding, so we had to do all of our research on the weekends. And essentially we only could get people who understood the value of, say, VO2 max testing and physiological testing. So that really limited our ability to actually recruit a wide array of people, right? We were definitely biased in terms of the people that we got, and they were very good athletes, but it's all, yeah, like if people read that study, and we'll go over it, I think, in the next couple of episodes, but we definitely have a non-representative population of people, if we're trying to expand what our conclusions were, to like a national level or something along those lines.
Yeah, we tried. I mean, we wanted to, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one requisite is they had to be active, but the more people we could have recruited, yeah, the better we could apply the knowledge that we find from the study. That's so true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so the bottom line for all of that is that we as researchers, are we're still experts in the field, but we recognize that, you know, the stuff that we know now, it could be totally different in 10 years based on, new studies coming out, based on new understandings of how, say, molecular mechanisms interact with each other. And it's just one of those things where I think that's the mark of, like a good problem solver. Doesn't have to be a scientist, because I take it we're talking to people out there who are coaches, who are athletes, who are just generally interested in this sort of stuff. But I think we can all, what we can do is we can apply our critical thinking caps to whatever it is that we're being taught, and ask intelligent questions about what's going on, and then make conclusions based on all the aggregate data that's coming out. For example, right, if if a study came out that was like, oh, here's the optimal training plan, but then and it was like an optimal training plan for like 100 people, something like that. But if you're the type of person, if you're a coach and you have an athlete who's like, oh, I absolutely hate doing what that type of training plan is, then there's no way that that is the best training plan for that athlete, right? So we have to take from the science and say, okay, hey, this is good science right here. But then you also have to know your athlete, and you have to know yourself, and you have to say, well, does it make sense in this context to be able to apply it?
Yeah, it's overwhelming, huh?
it, it is a little bit, but I think the at the end of the day, it kind of empowers everybody to be able to make your own decisions on things, in a world where a lot of the times you're told what to think. um so that's where I want to provide like links to research, and papers for people uh to actually read, right? We're going to be going over a few papers today, and probably a few papers every single podcast episode that we record. And I want to make those papers as available as I possibly can to people without stepping on copywriting issues and stuff.
As
But
long as they're open access, you shouldn't have a problem.
yeah, and that's, for the most part, that's what I'm going to be sharing. But then I want to, like, then we're going to talk about it. We're going to give kind of our lens, our context with it, and then it's kind of on you to either take that with whatever, however large of a grain of salt you need to take that with. And then if you need to dig into more, go out and actually read the research or read the papers, because you know maybe our lens from let's be honest, like, Dr. Jacobs and I are very skeletal muscle focused, and sometimes it's hard to see the muscle through the mitochondria, um,
Hmm.
as it were.
Very true.
Yeah. So I just wanted to get everybody kind of on the same page, empower you all to ask questions, read the articles, make your own conclusions. But if you're reading something, don't be so quick to just uh crap on it and just be like, this is worthless.
Dismiss or accept, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Be skeptical,
Mm-hmm.
scrutinize. And there are a host of people that are like, I don't want to think for myself. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. We'll do our best and try to provide, direction as best we understand it. But this is a process, a continual process that everybody's trying to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And as we figure more out, our recommendations or suggestions may change, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And okay, so with that, let's talk about predictors of performance, where we know everything.
Yeah.
No, not really. But the the first topic that I really wanted us to focus on was predictors of endurance performance, because I think it's really important for us as coaches, athletes, researchers to really understand what our general understanding of what physiologically makes somebody better at endurance sports compared to somebody else. There's been what a hundred almost, I mean, 100+ years of research recognizing these different predictors of performance, trying to explain, why is somebody capable of running a 2:05 marathon and then another person is only capable of running a 4-hour marathon. So I thought that was a good place for all of us to start, and then we can kind of jump down the rabbit hole of like the the physiological underpinnings of exercise, the adaptation response, the molecular pathways that are activated in order to get us these better predictors. And it's really what got me interested in the line of research that I went into, especially during my master's degree and into my Ph.D., because we still had those concepts present. But yeah, so and I think that it's near and dear to your heart too, Robbie, are the predictors of performance.
Totally. And it's because a lot of my work exists in this realm. As silly as sometimes it is, right? Because we try to strip apart some pretty complex systems into the most basic components. And in doing so, it's reductionistic.
Mm-hmm.
And often, when being so reductionist, eh, you lose sight of the biological nuance to other things that are associated or supporting or assisting some of these primary biological characteristics that we tend to focus on. So
Mm-hmm.
I'll try to keep a broad explanation, and even quote unquote saying predictors of performance, endurance performance, predictors of
Mm-hmm.
endurance performance for what events?
Mm-hmm.
Swimming, running, biking. They all are going to share general common attributes that promote performance in that sport, but the specific limiting factors are going to be different depending on
Mm-hmm.
the exact mode of exercise as well, right? And
Right.
so hopefully we do a good job in keeping our listeners cognizant of when we talk about general views and microscopic views, when we focus on something or when we're just kind of discussing in general, because
Mm-hmm.
it gets more complicated when you go close up, microscopic, back, telescopic.
Yep.
Things change.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll try. I think something that I'd like to try with this is like, we can give general overview and then we can kind of, dive
Break it
deeper,
down.
and that always helps me. So, largely speaking, I mean, the predictors of endurance performance, like I said, it's been about 100+ years worth of research. It's been recognized that the three best predictors of endurance performance are your VO2 max, which is your ability, your maximal oxygen consumption, your ability to intake oxygen from the environment, transport it all the way to your working muscle, and then use it within the mitochondria to resynthesize ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. So you have your VO2 max, and that's something that is like widely reported, across like even your Garmin watch will tell you what your VO2 max is, right? We'll get into maybe some of the limitations and challenges with just using performance variables to predict VO2 max, but it's pretty ubiquitous. People, I liken it to the size of your aerobic engine. So somebody with a low VO2 max has like a V4. Your little Honda Civic doesn't mean it's
He's
necessarily
talking
bad.
about me, everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Anytime I use a low example, it's always
He's
pointed
talking
at
about
Dr.
me.
Jacobs. uh, and then as you start to train, maybe you have a little bit bigger, and that's like a V6. And then you get start to get those people who are like the elite level athletes who are like a V8, V10. They have amazing aerobic engines. They're absolutely massive. And that's what a lot of people are like familiar with. They're like, oh yeah, those super highly elite athletes are super high VO2 max, but a VO2 max really only tells you how good your body is at uptaking and utilizing oxygen. So we need more characteristics, more variables to be able to help to describe endurance performance. So the second predictor of performance is where your thresholds are occurring. And I'm sure everybody kind of has heard ideas of thresholds, but essentially what thresholds are measuring are changes to systemic or local or systemic physiology where your body can no longer maintain the like steady state or status quo, you know, after you kind of shift through that threshold. Um, you want to add anything to that?
Um, so we just blown over VO2 max, moving on to thresholds.
Oh, I'm just introducing the general topics
Yeah,
right now.
thresholds. VO2 max is so I would put forth a VO2 max as a threshold, right?
Oh yeah.
When you're talking about biological thresholds, some people hate the term threshold because they're hard to identify sometimes. And so a
Mm-hmm.
threshold should denote a change, a specific change from one setting to another.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's not so clear, right? And so these exercise thresholds, they're either called exercise thresholds, performance thresholds, metabolic thresholds, because these thresholds that we discuss represent a change, like Phil was saying, to specific variables that tell us something about our biology and that will have influence on function. And so lots of people, I would say the most commonly discussed or recognized thresholds are lactate threshold or ventilatory thresholds.
Mm-hmm.
And through our discussion on thresholds, I'm going to introduce something that Phil doesn't even know about. And that ventilatory thresholds, I believe, why do we have lactate and ventilatory thresholds? Well, lactate is specific to changes in your blood lactate while exercising, and ventilatory thresholds are changes in really is suggesting ventilation. But the most well-known ventilatory thresholds are actually kind of monitoring carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
So I would put forth that from the ventilatory thresholds, we could further specify carbon dioxide thresholds or oxygen thresholds.
Mm. Yeah, and that's whole body oxygen thresholds because
Yeah,
on the flip side of things, there's also near infrared spectroscopy,
right.
which monitors your local oxygen thresholds.
Exactly.
And so there's all of these thresholds, and all they're trying to do is figure out when your physiology is changing from one point, one exercise intensity to another. Gives us an idea of what the physiological stress of the body actually is, say at one intensity compared to a different intensity. And it gives us a better indication individually of how challenging that exercise actually is for your body.
That's the big one,
Um,
right? It's
yeah.
how they're really gonna good thresholds should also represent like closely to how you feel
Mm-hmm.
and how sustainable the exercise is. That's a good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. So thresholds, if we're going back to the car analogy, are kind of, there's a couple, there's two thresholds generally, right? The I would say more people are familiar with the second threshold, which is kind of the delineation between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity. And that would essentially be like if you're driving your car and you're looking at the RPMs, that's where you're starting to redline. Anything over that red line is where you're starting to go over that second threshold. First threshold's a little different because it's measuring a little bit like slighter, like more like slight changes in your physiology. So you'll find it, first increase in lactate of 1 millimolar above resting, 2 millimole of lactate circulating within the blood, first increase in ventilation in response to CO2, and I think you're leading on to an oxygen threshold, first break point in NIRS or skeletal muscle oxygenation, um, And that first threshold is a little bit more of determining, well, it's determining where your maximal fat oxidation really is. That's where I think the first threshold really lies. And that's indicating where you're shifting from fat oxidation towards more uh, glycolytic or glucose oxidation. So it's more of a substrate based threshold that we're trying to estimate with things like lactate, ventilation, uh, SMO2, those sort of things. So that in and of itself is another kind of like efficiency. It's how efficient are you at burning a certain type of substrate. Um, Gets a little complicated, and that's why there's I think last time I looked, there's like 40 different lactate thresholds that have been determined. Uh, I know at least
Which ones are you most familiar with?
Um, so I mean, I think most people are familiar with like 2 millimole and 4 millimole. Um, and I want to make a specific episode about thresholds and just kind of like talk about them in a lot more
Totally.
detail
We could
because
probably do individual episodes on just
yeah,
lactate, on just
yeah,
ventilatory, on just
yeah.
critical power, on just FATMAX, right?
Yeah. So, and I think that would be useful for people because everybody is limited by what they can actually like say go into the lab and do. And, this being an applied physiology podcast, we need to be able to give people tools in their tool belt to say, oh, well, I have a lactate meter. Here's what I could do. Or I have a portable metabolic device that only measures oxygen consumption. How would I use that to actually like get my ventilatory variables? Um, or I have a Moxie monitor and, how am I supposed to get my SMO2? So yeah, I certainly think that making, like talking about those in depth, in future episodes would be amazing. Um, but yeah, so what I was getting at though is that thresholds are complicated and there's a lot of different ways that people have tried, to monitor them, estimate them, and in all actuality, it's we're just trying to figure out when those changes in physiology are occurring because then we get a better idea of what the primary adaptation is for whatever exercise intensity that we're trying to do.
Okay, so what about this? Let me see if I can. So if VO2 max roughly kind of references our maximal potential for aerobic power or the ability to generate aerobic power.
Mm-hmm.
Thresholds provide additional nuance, giving examples of sustainable aerobic power.
Mm-hmm.
With the first one, first threshold, kind of that we're going to be talking about, more long term, right? Long exercise, maybe restricted nutrition, where that upper threshold is better denotes exercise intensity when someone's not limited by nutrition. They're fully
Yeah.
carbohydrate loaded, have full glycogen stores. They're rested. They're not recovering. They're
Mm-hmm.
ready to blow up, right?
Mm-hmm.
To go as hard for as long as they can. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, I would say, you know, VO2 max is a threshold. I would say VO2 max is like kind of maybe like a ceiling. Like
Right,
it kind of it sets right. It sets like
right.
that high, I guess,
Sure.
and that would be a threshold, right? If you run into a wall, that's a threshold.
Like
Like
when
yeah.
you ran the 440 mile that you
Mm-hmm.
did, what do you think your VO2 was in relation to your VO2 max back then? Like 800-meter sprinters,
Yeah. I mean,
probably running at their VO2 max, right?
yeah. Yeah, that's like, and that's exactly what we saw when we did those 3 minute tests, like those 3 minute all out tests. We would see people regularly get to VO2 max. So it's like, well, if you can do 3 minutes and get to VO2 max, obviously
Right.
you kind of lose some of the nuances in terms of like the lower thresholds and then efficiency, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. But yeah, so I would say for like the super short things, right? 2,
Right.
4, and some people say like even if you're if you're an elite level athlete, like a 5K can almost be run
See?
VO2 max.
Exactly. But they wouldn't refer to it as that, right? They'd probably refer to
Right.
it as critical power. And so in some
Right.
instances, I would say that critical power and VO2 max may be synonymously discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It just depends on what the event is, right? What the
Right.
distance is, what the intensity and duration of exercise is. That helps us define limiting factors like we're going to be discussed, as well as kind of understand the usefulness of these different thresholds.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think too, the like all of these obviously like go into play. Like even in the Coyle and Joyner paper, they recognize that you know, VO2 max plus the ability to run, or plus your threshold gave you your performance VO2, which essentially kind of dictates your ability, whatever your speed or power output is at that speed. And obviously being able to access a higher percentage of your VO2 max is going to be beneficial for long-term power output. and then it comes down to like, so this is something I just gave a talk to some coaches, and we were talking about, when people go to altitude, their VO2 max can be reduced by like 20% if you go up to like 13,000 feet or something like that. And then they're like, well, does your lactate threshold also get reduced by 20%? And I was like, that's a really good question, because I would assume so, if not more, but I don't know.
So the intensity of exercise at which those thresholds occur when you're at
Yeah.
altitude,
Yeah, like the
they'll
percentages.
diminish. And how much they change in regards to VO2 max, I'm sure that data is out there that we could get more information. I don't know off the top of my head. That's
Yeah.
a good question.
Yeah. Because the way I was teaching it is I was saying, okay, well, when you go up to altitude, you're breathing more. And in the process of breathing more, you're going to have more oxygen demand, just because you're actually having to forcefully get oxygen into your body. So that's going to increase the amount of O2 that's required for a given exercise intensity. But it's not going to help with your performance, right? It's just essentially, this is what I need to do in order to be able to accomplish this task. So you'll have, your 20% reduction in VO2 max. Most likely that second threshold is still occurring at the same percentage of your VO2 max. So that's going to be reduced at least 20%. But then on top of that, you're also working harder because you're breathing harder. So that's going to be reduced more. So if you have super inefficient breathing, it's going to be reduced really, really bad. But if you're pretty efficient with breathing and everything, then it wouldn't be as much. So that was my
That's
my
great.
non yeah, that was
Can
my
I add to that?
yeah, for sure.
Because at altitude, our temperatures, do they tend to be warmer or more temperate?
Temperature would be a little cooler.
Right. And so possibly it all based on the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Could the extra O2 necessary for the ventilatory muscles be offset by maybe a redistribution of blood flow from the skin to the ventilatory? I get it's all context dependent, right?
Right. But then you're breathing more, so you're potentially losing more humidity through your breathing,
Totally.
which could then
Yep.
make you dehydrated,
You
which
do.
could
You
then
hemoconcentrate. You definitely
yeah,
do. That
yeah.
absolutely happens.
So, but then
Yep.
your heart rate's going to have to be higher because your plasma volume's lower. So it's all this, it's like,
Yeah.
it's complicated, right?
Yeah. Totally. Yep. I
But
like
yeah,
that.
because I kept getting the question like, oh, well, just tell me how much reduction in FTP I'm going to get. I'm like, you're,
Depends.
yeah, it's not as simple as just like, oh, 20% reduction, based on these studies. Cause they people sent me some of those studies, and like we just talked about, it's like, oh my gosh, there's so many things that you need to take into account. And in an ideal world, right, you'd get up to altitude early, you'd start adapting, you'd get over that kind of 72-hour phase of like dehydration and sleep issues and nutritional issues, and then you'd do like a little bit of a threshold style workout where you're recalibrating where you think your sustainable paces are, and then that would give you kind of your thresholds, right? And a lot of these races, unless you're like an Olympic level athlete who's going to race like in Mexico City or something for the Olympics, a lot of these races are going to be longer. So you're going to generally be racing closer to that fat max versus, closer to your VO2 max. So, I just recommend, I'm just like, look, you need to reduce your pace a lot. You can always speed up. It's hard. It's a lot harder to go out too fast and then hold on. Because if you're putting yourself in a calorie deficit, you're going to be primarily removing a lot of glycogen, and then you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, the cellular mechanisms that cause skeletal muscle fatigue are hard to reverse as you're still as you still have a lot of metabolic demand. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly why what you just said is true. It's hard to, when you've pushed yourself a little bit too far during competition, it's hard to untangle that metabolic knot
Yeah.
during the
Yeah.
competition.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is something we will definitely talk about, is like the mechanisms of fatigue, because there's a few myths around and about that I think we could bust a little bit. But yeah, so I think, I mean, that was a great discussion on thresholds, and kind of just how important it is, right? That's essentially going to be dictating how good your performance potential is. um, and then finally, you have to understand how well your body can convert chemical energy, which is coming from the breakdown of ATP within your muscle, and translate that to mechanical energy, which is like power or speed. um, and that's where researchers have come up with these terms, economy and efficiency. um, Economy is more based off of oxygen demand for a certain either speed or power output. Efficiency is energy demand, so it's slightly different. um, but what it's trying to do is it's trying to tell you, what's your MPG? What's your miles to the gallon? On your car. Are you a Prius, or are you a Ram 3500? Because you could have a VO2 max, you could have a huge engine and have a Prius efficiency, or you could have a huge engine and have like a really terrible diesel truck, like 5 miles to the gallon, sort of efficiency. And those are going to play greatly. Uh, it's going to affect your performance a lot.
Yeah, totally. And I'm sitting here kind of considering ways in which it's really noticeable how the importance of exercise economy or efficiency. In some sports, its importance seems, as we understand it currently, minimal, like with cycling. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have as big a role, especially when considering VO2 max and specific metabolic thresholds. Research has shown that it doesn't improve much to the explanation of the variation in endurance performance. But you take something like running, whoo,
Oh yeah.
economy is huge. And so let's just consider you and I for a second. Would you consider yourself a better cyclist or a runner? I think you're a better runner. I think
I
the
think,
stuff that you've done in running is more
yeah,
impressive than your respective feats
yeah,
with biking, right?
yeah.
I feel completely the opposite. I feel that my prowess in cycling is so much better relative to my running, and I really wonder if that may be attributed to exercise economy. I wonder if I have this really poor exercise economy.
Especially you're thinking when it comes to running.
Right.
Um, and I think, yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think efficiency takes the longest to develop. And it's something like, unfortunately, I wasn't super consistent, but I was consistent enough to see, pretty good leaps and gains in my 5K time, especially in high school. Um, and I think you because it takes so long to make those gains, I think you maintain those gains for longer.
Hmm.
So it's like I think Paula Radcliffe is actually a perfect example of this. There was a study that was done that followed her in her training and did physiological testing towards for like the last 5 or 6 years of her career. She used to be, I don't know if she is anymore, the women's marathon record holder. And what they found was that her VO2 max actually went down for the last 5 years of her training, but her efficiency levels kept going up and she kept getting faster. So that kind of brought about this idea that, especially in running, because it is such a, if you have, if you're taking one step and you're losing, like 2% energy per step, that, will compound, especially over like a 2 hour marathon, to the point where, that could be the difference between, running a 2 hour marathon or running a 2:15 marathon, right?
Totally.
So,
And the two components, as I understand it, that are really crucial to understanding somebody's exercise economy or efficiency is there's metabolic efficiency in, like you said, directly how much energy can we transfer from the bonds of the substrates, primarily fat and carbohydrate, that we rely on
mm-hmm.
during exercise, to ATP. That there's an efficiency with that, and a lot of energy is lost as heat. But even though we're fairly efficient in how we do that, but then once we have the ATP, we have to generate the force.
Mm-hmm.
And the force is generated, in the muscle belly, but then that force needs to propagate down the muscle across non-contractile components of the skeletal muscle, to the tendon, to the bone. And
Right.
so there's also an efficiency with that's very much based on the composition of the muscle. And so there are two big parts that make up our exercise economy or efficiency, with at least in my experience, poor understanding of how to separate those two in the lab. We
Mm-hmm.
just kind of combine those in our measures, right?
Yeah. The measures of economy and efficiency just take into account all of it.
Right.
And I'm not a biomechanics guy, but luckily we have Jonah on the podcast, and I want to ask him about this because he does a lot of like force plate testing for runners, and they can, with those force plate, they can measure if somebody uh, is able to transfer more force, compared to others. And then you can actually do things like, strength training, power training, other things like that to actually improve that. And I think, if you really wanted to get at, is this more of a metabolic efficiency issue, or is it more of a mechanical transfer issue, through the tendons, then you'd have to implement that, like, the force plate testing, the jumping, maybe running over a force plate, right? Because that's a little bit more indicative of actually what you're doing in running. Like in running, you're not just jumping up and down as quickly as possible. You are jumping from one foot to the other, but it's a little bit of a slower burn, as opposed to like the super intense jumping that you would maybe have somebody do. This is kind of sending me down a rabbit hole of thoughts right now. I think like it'd be really cool to see, because so there's this movement, right? Everybody should be running at 180 steps per minute. And I wonder if
Wait, is that real? Is that a legit recommendation?
yeah, that's like a lot of running coaches and stuff like recommend it, because they're like, oh, well, if you're running at 180 steps per minute, so it'd be 90, right? 90 cadence, then you're going to reduce the amount of force per push. And I mean, you'd probably be lowering your ground contact time. So then you'd be increasing your power. And if you're increasing your power, then you're increasing, potentially increasing your efficiency. Obviously you still need to understand, like the rate of force development and other things like that. But it's like, I wonder if you could take, something along those lines. I'm going to ask Jonah this on the next podcast that I'm on with him. maybe you could take some of those and actually have like an applicable efficiency value for running then, where you look at different cadences at different speeds and, then kind of find where your most efficient speed is and your most efficient cadence. Does that
I
be cool?
wonder how walking too, right? Because we all have our own cadence of walking. And there's
Mm-hmm.
research that's shown that we subconsciously kind of understand our most efficient pace. That's why some of us walk a little bit faster, some walk a little bit more slowly. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder how transferable some of that information that you get from walking also transfers over to running,
I would
because it's
say
different for
maybe,
sure.
yeah, I would say maybe a little bit but not a lot, because I can imagine, like, okay, this is going to be maybe a stretch in terms of connection here, but when I've just gotten back into cycling pretty regularly, and when
What's regularly like? So how
like I'll
much
do
do you ride?
I'll do like an hour every day.
Oh wow, okay,
Yeah, so 5 days a week.
sure. How much do you run
So
on top of that?
I haven't been running because I tweaked my Achilles, and I was just like, it's not worth it to be able to do nothing. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just ride, and so I've just been working on that. I'm not signed up for any races. I did that 50K back in May, and I was gonna try to do another one in October, but there were like some work things that were going on that I was like, it was
At a
too variable, so I
50K,
didn't get
you
into it.
didn't like plan it around your PhD defense or anything, did you?
Yeah, I did it 2 weeks before. It was kind of okay. So let me explain this to everybody. So during my PhD, I kind of gave up like training for anything because I got super super busy with you know trying to do a PhD because they're kind of
But
busy.
you did a lot of CrossFit, right?
But I was going like just to a class every day or like every other day or something. So
You were
that was just
specific training. You're just going
no.
and
I was going in and I was just trying to maintain my mental health, honestly. Like just
yeah.
go talk to the community at the gym, do things like that. So I wasn't training for anything. I didn't really feel like from a stress perspective that I could. Um, because every time I would start to train for something, I'd get like injured or, something like that. So I was just like, you know what? I don't need to do this right now. But then towards the end of my PhD, I was kind of like, I was getting really stressed. And when I'm super, super stressed, having kind of like something totally different to look forward to really helps me focus on the other things, and then I can bounce back and forth and be more effective. So I started training at the beginning of the year, and then I came back, or then I was like, it'd be fun, because I was targeting like 100K in October. That was the initial plan. And then I was like training, getting ready for my defense, getting prepared to go hike the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu. And then it just so happened I was just looking up like races and stuff, and it just so happened that there was a 50K uh, down the road from me a week from when I was looking. So it was like during the week. It was like on one of the weekends. It's like, it's only 15 minutes away. I don't have to drive very far. I just wake up and go and do the race. And there's still spots open, so I signed up for it. It was the MacDon 50K in Corvallis. It was actually pretty brutal, but yeah. So I signed up on a whim, and then I was like, I've been training. I've been doing my nutrition stuff. I've been doing other things like that, and uh, was able. I kind of went out there. I was like, I'm not going to win. I'm not going to do anything crazy here. I'm just going to go out and I'm just going to try to complete it. And I think it took me just under 7 hours, but I was able to do that. And then, yeah, my PhD defense was like 2 weeks after that. But at that point, I had already turned my document in. I was really only making like, edits to my presentation and making sure that was better. So,
I totally agree. But there's also this young man that I was familiar with that was very particular about events. It was big. It was a big move. I was proud that you did that. I think that
yeah.
that definitely had to have pushed you out of your comfort zone. Hey, speaking of your approach, did you consider your VO2 max, your thresholds, or your economy as you prepped for that race?
Oh yeah, I did.
How do you take them into account? How do you kind
Yeah,
of incorporate those into your approach?
yeah. I think with ultra training, or at least whenever I first start getting into stuff, I just like to do testing just to see where I'm at. So I did a number of VO2 max tests throughout, and
Do you do
I
them on a
was like,
treadmill or do you do them on a bike?
nope, I did them on a treadmill, and
Treadmill.
I did it inclined. So as opposed to changing the speed of the treadmill, I
Yeah,
just
you
changed
changed
the
the
incline as
incline.
much as possible. Um, and I think my VO2 max, went from like 55, and granted these were different metabolic carts and stuff, but like 55 to like 65 ish,
Whoa.
60, 65.
In how long? In what
Over the
amount of
course
time?
of January to May.
That's tremendous, man. That's
Yeah.
a really good improvement. Did your weight change? Your body weight?
Um, if anything, no, I don't think so. If anything, I gained a little weight actually, because I was like,
Wow.
I'm gonna eat as much as I need to maintain my academics and to be able to
Yeah, for
facilitate
sure.
all this training. So I did gain a little bit of weight, and going into it, so I've had this love hate relationship kind of with like weight and running and stuff, because I have this connection. I was in high school. I was 155 pounds. I was always a runner, 155 pounds. But then I went and I wrestled for like the winter, and I got down to like 135, 140. I was a twig, and I was the same height. I was like 6 foot tall, 140 pounds. Got super skinny, and then went and set all my personal records my junior year, of running and everything like that. Absolutely was killing it. Um, and then I got injured or something like that towards the end of the season. So that should have been the number one red flag. But I always made these connections like, oh, the skinnier I am, the faster I am. And you know, it's an acute improvement in performance. So I was like, okay, well, now, I'm pretty much in the worst shape that I've ever been. Um, I want to stay healthy. I need to stay healthy essentially. So I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna try to eat as much carbohydrate as I possibly can, try to maintain my protein intake, and we're just gonna go from there. So I during my actual race, I was like 175, which is as big as I've probably been during any event that I've done. And the whole time I was able to maintain like my training, and didn't get sick. I got sick after the race because I killed myself during the race and then didn't eat for 3 days because I couldn't eat.
Well, that's normal.
um
I mean, that's such
yeah,
a that stimulus of 50K is so overwhelming to your
yeah,
immune system, and then you remove it, right?
yeah,
Because now you have a PhD defense. I expect that even the best would probably have most likely gotten sick in that situation.
yeah. But the bottom line is I was able to kind of improve my VO2 max. I wasn't doing specific, say, VO2 max workouts other than, okay, actually, so, yeah. So the way that my training was set up is I'd wake up in the mornings and I do 20 to 30 minute run, like, and built that up over the course of the 5 months that I was training. And then Monday,
Fasted or
Wednesday,
fed?
fasted. I would just drink some coffee and then just go for it was like easy. Um, and it wasn't because I was trying to stimulate more mitochondrial biogenesis or anything like that. It was just like, it was because it fit with my habits of life. I would just drink my coffee, do my Instagram sort of stuff, and then go for a run when I was done with that. And that just works for me. In 20 to 30 minutes, right? You don't need to fuel 2 hours beforehand or anything like that. Um, and then Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I would do something where I would go to the gym on campus, and I would do like stair stepper for an hour. And this is where like the zone 2 training kind of came in, because I was able, from my physiology testing, to be able to say, okay, my heart rate should be around 130. So if I wear a heart rate strap, I'll just go to 130 on that day. And I was, try to crank it out for an hour. During most, if not all of those training sessions, I was eating because I didn't want to be in too much of a calorie deficit. which would just give my body another stressor to try to overcome once I was done. And then Tuesdays and Thursdays I would do bike workouts, but they were on a fan bike that I had. It was like a C2 bike erg, which I really like those, but I would do kind of like VO2 max style intervals.
Well,
So it'd
those are
be like
brutal.
three.
Those bikes are tough. How
Yeah.
long
So
would you
it's
ride?
not one of those. It's just more of like, like a regular riding bike, but it would be like, you know, 10-15 minute warm up. And I would use my NIRS device, my Moxie, to dictate if I was warmed up or not. And then I would just go into it and I would just say, okay, well, today, I think what I was doing is I was doing 2 days a week of 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off. And I'd repeat that 2 to 4 times, depending on how I was feeling. And I felt like that was a good way of kind of getting that high end training without getting the high impact of running outside.
Would you use any threshold measures from your Moxies as well? Like any?
No, for the VO2 max stuff, it was just like, okay, how hard can you go for 3 minutes? So it wasn't, and I wasn't doing dedicated threshold work either. Like I wasn't trying to do, like 30 minutes at X threshold, but I did I did try to measure, like my second FTP, critical power, whatever you want to call it, on the bike, just to kind of know where I was. And I think at least on that bike, I was, could maintain, depending on the day, 280 to 310 watts for those 3 minutes, which would be about critical power, right? If we're thinking about the critical power curve. So I definitely could not maintain that for very long. And now that I'm riding on my Wahoo kicker with my mountain bike, man, like the erg mode is so much harder than just like the free spinning
I have a
fans.
theory on this. I have a theory.
I want to hear it. Let's hear it.
Well, and so I've even talked to some well-known cycling coaches about this. I noticed when I was really getting into cycling, and I would cycle on Swift, it kind of shows your power profile, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of noise, but I really got interested in looking at my power profile when I would race,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm very confident that if I were to successfully add some noise like filters on that you could see almost an exercise signature of my race performance. And I think it's because of, for steady state exercise, we have motor units that are fatiguing and withdrawing and having other motor units activating and at it all the time. And so this concept, even when we're maintaining the same output over time, that doesn't mean that we're using the same motor units to achieve that output.
Right.
And so I really think, and so I practiced and having, rather than just erg mode where I stayed steady, is I go up, then I go down, then I go up, then I go down. And if you find the right profile that matches, your metabolic capacities of your muscle, I was able to maintain a higher power output over that period of time than if I just set it to erg mode. And so I asked Steve Johnson, who used to coach USA Cycling back in the day, and he was like, absolutely. Somebody can maintain over a period of time a higher power output if there are almost microcycles within that consistency.
That's so interesting you say that, because I think that kind of happens automatically on like the fan bike that I have, right? Like you're trying to maintain, say, 300 watts or whatever, but then you're 280, 310, 280, 310, you're going back and forth. And it is so much easier, to do like performance stuff on the fan bike versus on the Wahoo kicker. When I say fan bike, I'm talking a C2 biker. So it's essentially just like a stationary bike, but you just have a fan, and then I have clip and pedals and everything for it. So Yeah, it was interesting because I've since shifted, and I'm like, man, I could, like, the other day I did, it wasn't even a threshold workout, but it was like a moderate threshold workout where I would like boosted it up to 204, like 204 watts, and then just try to hold that there for I think like 12 to 16 minutes. And I was like, holy crap, like this seems so much harder than, like 204 would be nothing
Totally.
for me, like on one of the
Totally.
other bike. It's
Yeah.
like,
I'll struggle one day trying to maintain like 210 or 215. I'll go race later in that week and my output would be average of like 235, 240. And I was like, oh, that felt easier. I mean, I'm sure that some of it is I'm competing and maybe I'm engaged a little bit more, but
right.
and I think also I'd be willing to propose that specific muscle signatures or power profile signatures will explain some of fiber composition. So skilled
Yeah.
muscle fiber type distribution
Yeah.
of someone as
Yeah.
well.
I wonder, I mean, and this is something, so going back to like these papers, that's something that has been talked about a lot, is like, type 1 fiber type composition, which is type 1 fibers are your endurance fibers. They're, the least fatigable. They have the most mitochondria, depending on how trained you are, so on and so forth. But there's still some unknowns in terms of, it still seems like having more type 1 fibers, even though type 2A fibers are really adaptable, having more type 1 fibers is still more beneficial, at least for like that gross mechanical efficiency. So I wonder if that plays into it, right? If people who have more type 1 fibers are the ones that can, maintain a slower deviation across the entire time, because they're not, jumping into their type 2A fibers, which are then going to be their larger motor units. So they're going to be contracting harder. So then, you're going to potentially get more power output. Um, that would be cool. Yeah, that would be really sweet to do some muscle biopsies and start to analyze like fiber type composition with that.
Phil, good on you. You just pointed out something super important that I missed. Type 1 fibers absolutely are. But, and this is coming from me, people, I think, focus too much on the mitochondrial content related to fiber types and not the energetic demand of contraction itself.
Mm.
So, independent from mitochondrial content, slow twitch fibers require less ATP to manage calcium kinetics, intracellular calcium kinetics. They're just less expensive to run from an ATP perspective. And so when you consider, yeah, sure, type 2A and slow twitch, type 1 skilled muscle fibers may have the same amount of mitochondria. There's some research showing that type 2A fibers may even be higher, but that's just the input of ATP. What about the output?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Type 2A fibers utilize ATP at a significantly quicker clip than your slow
Mm-hmm.
twitch. And so that's right where you're saying efficiency seems to relate more to these slow twitch type 1 fibers. Yeah, it's because they require less ATP to manage the same relative force that they're capable of generating than
Mm-hmm.
our fast twitch cohorts of fibers as well.
Yeah, which then is also super interesting because like the one realm of this podcast is a little bit more on the CrossFit side of things, and there's a CrossFit Games athlete, Rich Froning, who has been reported to have a VO2 max when he was at his peak of like 74.5 or something like that, which is absolutely insanely high, right?
Because he's
But
probably pretty big, like in terms of muscle, and
he's
so
like
that's taking into
195
account.
pounds.
Yeah, and so if you were then to convert that into absolute VO2, that's huge.
Yeah. So let's just say we believe the numbers here, right?
Okay.
If like there's no way in, sometimes one of the CrossFit coaches likes to talk about how, oh, if Rich Froning, just, decided to run a marathon, he'd be able to run like a 215 or something like that. It's like there's no way. Even with a 75 or 74 and a half as his VO2 max. But what I'm getting at is that I think that because CrossFitters require so much force output, I would imagine if you did like a skeletal muscle biopsy on them, they would have an insane proportion of type 2A fibers. Those type 2A fibers are going to be insanely mitochondrial dense just because of the nature. CrossFit is essentially an endurance sport that just requires you to be super strong. So I imagine, like, so getting back to like this like translational piece, his VO2 max is super high, but I can almost guarantee you his mechanical efficiency is going to be super low, or just his efficiency in general. And that could be one of the reasons explaining that, right? He could have such a high VO2 max, but then because he's mostly type 2A fibers, he's using a lot of ATP. And, then, that's just a lot of ATP is a lot of energy or a lot of heat release, a lot of energy release, and it's probably not going to be quite as efficient, if he had more type 1 fibers.
Exactly. That is like certain Formula One racing. I'm sure that the pit crew doesn't say, "Hey, what does this car get for miles per gallon?" Right? They just want to know pure like,
Yeah.
what's this engine capable of? But then for a longer road race where you do have to refuel and that becomes an issue, right? Then you want to pay a lot more closer attention to something like that economy. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with you got a little bit more time, right, that you have set free. Sweet. With the last, little bit, I think we can kind of dive in even a little deeper to the Vandersword paper where we kind of started to touch on this with fiber type composition, but since the first paper, it's not really the first paper, but since Coyle and Joyner and Coyle came up with their paper on predictors of performance, another guy who have you worked with Steven Vandersword?
I haven't.
No. But we like him because he cited our papers. And a lot of your papers actually, as I was reading through this, but he's kind of on, he expanded this model where, he took endurance performance and said, okay, well, endurance predictors of performance are, your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, and your efficiency and your economy. But from the paper that you and I came out with during my master's degree, we were started to, and other work that you'd done previously, we started to say, hey, the mitochondria and mitochondrial function is really important for performance as well. And so what they did is they took kind of like that aggregate data, the paper we published, the paper you published, and they started to say, okay, well, what are the skeletal muscle determinants of endurance performance, and how are they related to the three endurance performance predictors that we talked about earlier: threshold, VO2 max, and economy and efficiency. And I mean, it all kind of makes sense if you understand, kind of like fiber types and other things like that. But I mean, they're one of the best predictors of performance. VO2 max, lactate threshold is your proportion of type 1 fibers. It's like, okay, that makes sense, right? Because of the characteristics that come with type 1 fibers. They require less ATP, for contraction. They have high levels of mitochondrial volume density. All right, so my question is there a difference in mitochondrial function across to fiber types?
Not that we know of. And I really, the resolution that we're able to test different various indices of quote unquote mitochondrial function, they're probably still too blunt to tell. And really, a lot of my work just looks at oxygen kinetics. So really, how much oxygen can mitochondria use, where there's roles of calcium and other factors that maybe other researchers, if they hear this, they'll be like, that guy's a dummy because he's not aware of this, and this. But at least in terms of the ability to utilize, to reduce oxygen to water, There's no evidence to suggest such as
Yeah.
of now.
Yeah. Something that I got really interested in at the end of my PhD was this idea of like mitochondrial morphology, like cristae formation and everything, because I think that's super important for the initial adaptations of the mitochondria in response to exercise. And it's something that we haven't really been able to look at lately or, before. And I wonder, and then so then you start to think, okay, well, if we're reforming, like the cristae, which are essentially pockets where the mitochondria can put more hydrogens and sequester the hydrogens for ATP. For those of you who don't really know, just throwing out random words, but and then on top of that, super complex formation, right, could also play into the ability of our mitochondria to actually efficiently stack complexes on top of each other. Not become more efficient, but just use more oxygen per square millimeter, square micrometer. Uh, but but I think that's something that could be a really interesting field of study eventually. Like if people were able to take a type 1 fiber, type 2A fiber, start to look at that sort of stuff, start to look at the responses to exercise, start to really look at differences in morphology, other things, then that could maybe uncover a little bit more of maybe why we see those big differences in type 1 fibers as well. Yeah, because they also talk about like capillarization and myoglobin content. Are There's got to be differences in myoglobin content between type 1 and type 2A fibers, right?
I would think there is. Just looking at muscle, I've worked with muscle samples for a long time, and especially rodent
Mm-hmm.
muscle. You can visually see a difference between muscle that's primarily slow twitch, like soleus is super
Yep.
deep red, and some of the other muscles. But what's interesting? I got an email this morning from a co-author for a paper that was invited to be resubmitted for the potential to be published. The title is Skeletal Muscle Mitochondria Demonstrate Similar Respiration per Cristae Surface Area Independent of Training Status and Sex in Healthy
Interesting.
Humans, with some co-authors names such as Niels Ortenblot, Joachim Nielsen, Karsten Lundby. So, and Phil does not know that this study
Mm-hmm.
was conducted and that this research is about to be published. We agree. We think that that's a very interesting area
Yeah,
of research
that's
for sure.
awesome. I'm so glad that is being looked at, because that was something that I saw during my PhD, and I wanted to do some grant proposals for it and stuff, but obviously with time and everything didn't get around to it. But yeah, that's I really think like cristae density is super important. How much surface area you have within your mitochondria is going to dictate how many electrons you can pass, how many hydrogens you can sequester, how much like how
Heat
yeah.
you can dissipate. So, just since you've been in the lab, I've had this transformational experience, uh, just kind of learning more and more about how important
Mm-hmm.
heat is, not just in not just for adaptation, but also potentially. I have theories how skeletal muscle temperature may actually help dictate lactate
Hmm.
thresholds. Um, I think that skeletal muscle temperature may be a primary stimulus for skeletal muscle fatigue, inducing skeletal muscle fatigue. And just like you were saying, the surface area of the mitochondria, you think the mitochondria, I was in preparation for this podcast, I wanted to look up because I've seen some figures that show pretty tight correlations between skeletal muscle
Mm-hmm.
capillarization. And I don't know exactly, there are different characteristics of the capillarization that are often looked at. But there's research showing that changes in mitochondrial volume density and capillarization are pretty close. They're very close related, and probably across fiber types, kind of like you're saying. If we're just looking at type 1, I bet you that also myoglobin concentration is strongly correlated. If we just look at type 2, the myoglobin concentration is probably correlated tightly as well. And so these components, is it really capillarization, myoglobin, and mitochondria, or is it the collection of them all together functioning as one? Right. And so that's why I try to put forward that you combine those characteristics of the skeletal muscle, and you get like skeletal muscle oxidative potential, maybe rather than mitochondrial capacity. It's more encompassing of all these accessory functions that really help the mitochondria do what they do.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. I 100% agree with that. And that's something like, using this is where I think NIRS is super valuable, because you have the ability of essentially measuring that to
that unit, that oxidative potential.
And that was exactly the terminology that we were using in the paper, because we were like, well, it's muscle oxidative capacity. It's not mitochondrial capacity, because we're not specifically just looking at the mitochondria. This isn't us taking a muscle sample from somebody, taking out all the mitochondria, or taking a single permeabilized fiber. It's looking at the oxygen kinetics that are happening at the level of the capillary beds, more or less. And then, looking at how quickly, you essentially reperfuse oxygen after you go essentially ischemic, right? Like an arterial, after an arterial occlusion. So yeah, that's, man, that actually makes a lot more sense, now that we're talking about that.
And so the relationship of NIRS-derived measures of skeletal muscle oxidative potential are stronger in their relationship to performance than individual kind of measures that are more representative of maybe a mitochondrial characteristic in the skeletal muscle. And just as you were saying, I think that being able to capture some of this accessory function, maybe it's not even accessory, some of the totality of metabolic function with NIRS probably explains its stronger relation to endurance performance.
I think it's becoming it's more of an integrative measure versus a reductionist measure, like what we were talking about. And those integrative measures are super important, right? Like the ability to transport oxygen from the capillary bed, transfer that to myoglobin within the muscle, and then myoglobin keeping oxygen tension high enough that it's really easy just to pluck it off, the mitochondria to pluck off that oxygen and just use it, right? All of those play into that cascade effect. And it's funny how we take out, say essentially take away the capillaries if we're using permeabilized fibers, get rid of all gradients, get rid of almost everything. Or if we're doing isolated mitochondria, which we did a lot in my lab, it's like you're getting rid of almost everything.
Right. And you're breaking it apart and letting it come back together, and kind of spontaneously. So I think it's truly amazing. I'm continually amazed at how well isolated measures of mitochondria relate to certain biological functions. Just when you know exactly kind of the methodology, you're taking the scarecrow completely apart, letting it kind of come back together spontaneously, and then using that as a surrogate for biological in vivo function in the body, right?
No, it really is. And if you talk to the wrong people or the right people, depending on how you view it, they would say isolated mitochondria is, trash and completely useless. But, it's
just like publications, right? We get a little bit of information. Give me all the information you got, because anybody who is so flippant or quick to dismiss data often forgets small oversights, or they miss something. Right?
Yeah, I think that this is a really good stopping point, because I think next week what we can do is we can talk about the paper you and I published together, and then kind of, what's happened in the last 3 years of research and everything and kind of follow up with that, because you're still ingrained with all of that sort of stuff. I kind of stopped, when I was done with my master's, but I want to continue this conversation next week. I think this week, was great. We talked about the three main predictors of endurance performance: VO2 max, thresholds, and efficiencies. Then we started to talk about actually how I use those a little bit during my training and everything. And, we got down to, this idea that it's probably, endurance performance is most likely predicted by the ability to transport and utilize oxygen within, kind of like that integrated pathway from capillary to myoglobin to mitochondria. So man, this is the sort of stuff. So one of the reasons why I loved my master's degree is because Robbie and I would have conversations like this every single day. I wouldn't get any work done. I would take away from all of his work getting done. But I'm so fortunate now that we actually get to have these conversations again. So this is great. I hope all of you, get good insights and takeaways from this sort of stuff. If you're on YouTube watching this video, comment down below what sort of questions do you have, what sort of papers would you be interested in us looking at. If you can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. And
you could find me at Phil's Critical02 on Instagram.
Yep. I was going to say you can find Robbie at he's not willing to divulge his social media quite yet.
Well, I can, and if people search me out and find me, that's cool. That's not the end goal for me. I just like being on and talking about science.
Yeah, and that's awesome, and I will forward any great questions that people have to you, and we'll probably just end up discussing them on the podcast as it is. So great episode today. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, this is why we started the podcast, is to talk science and to do this sort of stuff. So don't be strangers, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.